So in this video, we're hopefully going to demonstrate how a tie rod works, what it is, and its overall function, and why eccentric bolts are used to facilitate the function of a tie rod. So what does eccentric mean then? So let's just, do the logical thing and look at a dictionary. So focusing on the technical term here, of a thing not placed centrally or having its axis or other part placed centrally. Now I've highlighted the axis here because we're going to be basically focusing on the axis part. We're going to want to look at the axis because that is key to understanding what an eccentric bolt does, its function, and how it interacts with a tie rod. So let's get back into looking at our eccentric bolt. So looking at our eccentric bolt here, I want you to focus on two lines here that I'm going to draw in a dotted yellow pattern. You'll notice that one line has a bit more distance to cover from the outside or the outer end of the washer to the center of the bolt, and the other line has a much shorter distance. Now this is key to understand because this is where the eccentric part of the eccentric bolt comes in. You'll notice with most bolts is that the bolt head will always be in the center of the washer. Now there are exceptions of course, but in the sense of an eccentric washer, as what we're discussing here, it is not in the center of the washer, hence the name eccentric bolt. So this difference in distance, which I'll draw here in blue, is key to the function of how the eccentric bolt will work. So to understand this a bit more fully, let's bring the tie rod here into the equation. So now I'm going to simulate turning this eccentric bolt here in our diagram counterclockwise. Now notice as I'm turning it counterclockwise, what happens to the wheel and tire. I want you to focus on both the head of the bolt, the washer, how it turns, and what is happening as a consequence to the wheel and tire. So I'll repeat this twice, so let's look at it once. As it turns counterclockwise, focusing on the bolt, we'll notice that the bolt head is going towards the road, or what we would say the outside of the vehicle, and the fatter part of the washer that is part of the eccentric bolt is now facing in. Now this is key to notice that the fatter part of the washer, as it turns in, you can notice that eccentric bolt is in a cage, essentially on both sides. That cage does not expand or open, it is fixed. Now as it's turning, the fatter end of the washer is now on the left-hand side and the bolt head is on the right-hand side facing the road. Now if we repeat this once more, going counterclockwise, again, let's focus on the wheel and tire. So as the eccentric bolt here in this instance is turning counterclockwise, our wheel and tire are starting to be pushed out in relation to the road. So it's no longer perfectly parallel, it's facing out. Now there's a few things to note here and there are a few exceptions. What I've marked here in the blue is saying it's a fixed unit. The eccentric bolt and the tie rod are not one piece. However, when you bolt them through, essentially running the eccentric bolt through the ear of the tie rod, and all that means is it's just going through the hole of the tie rod, they act as a fixed unit. They're not necessarily one piece, but when you bolt them together and cinch it down, it acts like one piece. Now another thing to note here is, you might jump to the conclusion and say, well, if the fatter end of the eccentric bolt, and please understand that I'm using common terminology here, but if the fatter end of the eccentric bolt is facing in, then the wheel is always out, right? Well, that's not necessarily true. It really depends on how the tie rod is designed on certain vehicles. This was modeled after the wagon, which you'll see on the series here in the W124 series, and that eccentric bolt acts exactly as we see here in the diagram. Depending on where the tie rod connects on the hub, whether it's on the front of the hub or the rear of the hub, they will have opposite effects. But for the sake of simplicity, we're just going to focus on this specific design here for the sake of explanation. Now, what does it mean when our tire is facing out? It's no longer parallel with the road. So if the tire, we'll say wheel and tire in this instance, if the wheel and the tire are no longer parallel with the road and it's facing outside, as we see here from the body of the car, that's what we would call a toe out condition. So tie rods are measured as toe in and toe out, almost like when someone is pigeon-toed or when their feet are outside and it's called toe out. So you can almost simulate this with your foot. If you had put your foot on the road exactly parallel, you would be at a toe of 0 degrees. If you were to point your toes out, you would have an instance that we see here, which is toe out. So this this isn't measured, right? But we're just going to say that this is positive 45 degrees of toe out. So if you ever find yourself stuck trying to understand what toe is, just look at your toes. Look down, they're right on you. Provided that you do have your toes, you could use them to essentially explain the definition of toe in and toe out. It is literally as it says. If your toes face in, that's toe in. If your toes face out, that's toe out. So imagine your body is essentially the body of the vehicle, and if your toes are pointing out, toe out. If your toes are pointing in, toe in. So let's see what happens when we do the opposite here on the eccentric bolt. So let's reset our eccentric bolt and assembly here. Now what I'm going to do, instead of going counterclockwise, I'm going to go clockwise. And once again, I want you to look at the eccentric bolt and washer and how it works on the wheel and tire itself. Now you can also notice the tie rod itself is moving, and this does happen in real life. The tie rod, again, is what physically is pushing and pulling the hub on the wheel. Now in this instance, we've done the exact opposite. The fatter end of the washer is essentially facing out. Now the one thing I want to mention here is the red part of the bolt is what is going through the ear in the tie rod. The washer itself is just acting as a spacer, pushing and pulling within that cage that it's in. The bolt itself is what I'm saying is quote unquote a fixed unit with the tie rod. Now you'll notice as the bolt moves into the vehicle, has moved more left now, the tie rod itself is being pulled in. And assuming that the tie rod is in the front of the hub, that's going to pull our wheel and tire assembly in. Now again, remember, if your toes are both pointing in, that's a toe-in condition. Same thing here. The wheel and tire assembly is no longer parallel with the road. Instead, it is pointing inside. So now when we're pointing inside, that would be what's considered a toe-in condition. So it would be negative 0.45 degrees. So 0 degrees is perfectly parallel. If our toe is pointing in, we're negative, and if our toe is pointing out, we're positive. So that's all there is to it. That's pretty much how toe, tie rod, and eccentric bolts all work together to happily align your car and keep it going down the road. If you like videos like this, please don't hesitate to subscribe. If you have any comments or you caught some errors on my part, drop a comment below. I'd love to hear some feedback or anything else. If you like animated videos and explanations like this, I'd be happy to make more in the future, and I do plan to make more in the future. If you have any ideas on topics or things that you would like to see, drop a comment below, and I'll see if I can incorporate it in a future video. And again, if you like car content, that's what we're about here. This channel will diverge into other topics in the near future, so stay tuned for that. And I hope you've enjoyed this video and found it helpful.